I want to welcome all of you to a very exciting program. And it's a panel. I'm not going to introduce and go through each of the bios of our 4 wonderful participants, but I'm sure you have seen them, and they are all outstanding teachers, thinkers, writers, contributors to Jewish life and to the Jewish people, and they also happen to share that they are Pardes alum as well. So we like to take like 1% credit for all the wonderful things that they continue to do in the Jewish world. I think we have a very interesting and engaging topic. I imagine some of you, when you saw the topic, may have thought about the current pandemic. Others may have associated with Tisha B'Av and destruction of the temple and other tragedies of the Jewish past. Some of you may have thought about the complicated, difficult political times we are living in, with tremendous tension happening, not just in the United States, but also now in Israel and also in Europe and other places as well. So whatever your association was, I think we are all looking for some wisdom, some insight, some creative thinking, and a sense of where we go in terms of sort of how we navigate and negotiate difficult times, and perhaps how we grow and learn from them. So what we're going to do is the speakers are each going to have a chance to discuss the text that they chose. The text was available to download in your email invite. I think it'll also be posted how to download it in the chat. So each of our speakers are going to have a chance to speak and share their thoughts around the text they shared, and perhaps hopefully more broadly about other issues that they want to address. After that, we're going to leave some time for the speakers to have a chance to respond to one another and be in dialogue with each other about the things that they've heard and questions they might have, or how to take it deeper. And after that, we will leave some time at the end for questions from our electronic audience. Because everyone will be muted, I will be checking the chat. If you have a question for the panel, please post your question in the chat, and we'll get to as many of those questions at the end as we can. And hopefully that was the most you will have heard from me during this entire program. So I want to begin by asking my dear friend and colleague and wonderful person, Marc Baker, to begin.
I just was saying thanks, Zvi. It's an honor to be here with everybody. I probably speak for all of us. I feel like all of you have been my teachers, some from near, some from far. Some of you don't even know you've been my teachers, but it's really a privilege to be here with you. And thinking not only about what our Jewish tradition has to say about this question, but how it speaks to us and where it is with us in our heads and in our hearts. And I want to say my answer to this question, I'm going to talk about this text, but I feel like it's been really informed, as is my reading of this text, by my own going through the mourning process for my father already 6 years ago. And my first place that I went when I looked at this question actually was to Jewish mourning practices. So I'm grateful to our tradition for their mourning practices, and to a fair amount of therapy that has informed my reading of this text. So my short answer to the question, will things ever be the same, is no. And no, things will not ever be the same. We will grieve what we've lost. We'll move forward, we'll rebuild, and we will find joy. And no, things will not ever be the same. And I think the real question is how? How will we experience and navigate the grief that comes with the loss? And how will we navigate the anxiety that I think human beings feel about being cut off from our past? And I chose this text from Baba Batra because I think that's what this text is about. This is the story. I see it almost in the aftermath, with literally that the temple still on fire, though it probably took place years later, of a discussion about how we make sense of loss. And it's the discussion between Rabbi Yoshua and these ascetics. It seems asceticism was on the rise, and denial as a form of dealing with this grief and loss. And I just want to unpack a couple of lines in this text that I think hit at the essence of this question. The first is the ascetics question to Rabbi Yoshua when he asks them, why aren't you eating meat and wine? And they say, Nochal basar shemimenu makrivin al gabei mizbeach v'achshav batel. How can we eat meat when there's no more temple in which we can sacrifice meat? And I'm thinking about what is behind that question. Why do they feel like they can't eat meat? Why is denial connected to grief? And I've got three possible answers to that. One is, it's just too painful. Every time we eat it, it reminds us of what we've lost. So we need to deny ourselves the joy of meat and wine. The second is it feels disrespectful to the past. How can we sit eating meat and wine when no one can sacrifice it anymore, when the temple's in ruins? Like it feels like almost it's like a disgraceful to what's come before us. And the third, I think, is the fear of forgetting. Maybe if we keep eating meat and wine, a little time goes by and we forget actually our past and what we've lost. And so the ascetics response is denial. No, we will hold on to the past, we'll hold on to our grief in ways that I think ultimately we see from this text are unsustainable, that keep us stuck in the past and that reinforce a dichotomy between remembering and moving forward or forgetting, and a dichotomy between grief and joy. And that I think is where the ascetics leave us in that place, in that false choice. And that I think is the power of Rabbi Yoshua's, I think, loving response to them. And I see it as gentle and loving. He says, Banai, Banai, my children, let me teach you how we're supposed to do this. Rabbi Yoshua, and I think the Jewish tradition, rejects the dichotomy between grief and joy, and the dichotomy between remembering and moving forward. Shelo lehitabel kol ikar efshar, ulehitabel yoter midai efshar. To not mourn at all is impossible, but to mourn too much, and to mourn too much is impossible. And so what that leaves us with is the need, and this text with, is the need to find a third way. And I think that third way is the ritualizing of moving forward that we see in the text. If you're going to eat a meal, leave a little bit undone. If you're going to build a house, leave a little bit undone. It's not in this text, but I don't think any of us aren't thinking about breaking a glass at a wedding. When you have your times of joy, just bring a reminder with you. And I think the message of this text is that instead of holding on to the past in a way that is kind of an unhealthy attachment, that can actually be maladaptive, that can hold us back, we've got to find a way to bring the past with us into the future. And when we're able to do this, we're integrating our grief into our joy. And we're integrating our memory of the people we've lost, of the traditions we've lost, of the temple we've lost. We're integrating that into our evolving sense of self. And this, I think, teaches us that remembering doesn't have to hold us back, but actually can propel us forward, and that grief doesn't have to diminish our joy, but actually our joy can be fuller because it's able to contain our grief. And when I reread this text again in advance of this, so my new reading right now of the end of Yimeshkechech Yerushalayim is that what it means to A'alet Yerushalayim al Rosh Simchati doesn't mean that I diminish my joy a little bit because I remember Jerusalem, but actually I'd like to read it as I complete my simcha. My simcha is complete because it can contain the pain and the grief that comes with destruction and loss, and because my looking forward can actually contain my memory of Yerushalayim, of the Beit HaMikdash, and of everything that's come.
Okay, Marc, thank you very, very much. Yaffa?
Rabbi Baker, my colleague, thank you so much for that beautiful Torah. I feel like you can tell we went to the same school. I also want to talk about what it means to be remembering and moving forward. But first, I want to say that I'm really so filled with joy to be with you all, which is probably totally forbidden on Tisha B'Av. So I'm feeling some guilt at how happy I am to be on this esteemed panel and to be with Pardes and to be with all of you. It's such a joy. So I'll try to tamper that with reading some sad midrash. But I also want to say, I'm a fan of preambles. I went to law school and that's what they taught us. So I also want to say that I feel somewhat challenged on this topic because I relatively have had a very easy experience of the pandemic. And in a very I sort of feel very similarly to when I've tried to experience Tisha B'Av in past years, because thank God I have been so fortunate and I haven't really undergone tremendous tragedy. And we really are living in a time right now of tremendous tragedy. I just want to say, and Tisha B'Av this year feels so close. What it means to be in a time of tragedy for thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who have lost loved ones and who are frightened for the future. And I just want to say that it's so, so close to us. And what does it mean to be present in that pain, even if you're relatively secure, to really try to access that pain, which is what I believe our tradition asks us to do on this day of Tisha B'Av. So I was thinking a lot about what it means to Chadesh Yameinu Kekedem, what it means that we ask to renew our days as of old, right? So this is, of course, the second to last pasuk that we read of Megillat Eicha. Hashivenu Hashem Elecha v'nashuva, return us, God, to you, and we will return. Chadesh Yameinu Kekedem, renew our days as of old. And as the tradition goes, we, even though it's the second to last pasuk, we repeat it again at the end, at the closing, all together. We say it together and what it means to request that. And of course, we want to go back to days of old, right? But as Rabbi Baker sort of said to us, there's a tension between what it means to return to days of old and what it means to return at all. And so I think this question, it seems sort of obvious, I want to get back to the good old days. And Chazal also, the rabbis of the Midrash here in Eicha Rabba, I think also are struggling with two very fascinating things. I just want to read this Midrash. I have to say it's one of my favorite Midrashim, where on the first part of this pasuk, Hashivenu Hashem Elecha v'nashuva, right? Return us, God, to you, and we will return. There seems to be a struggle between Knesset Yisrael, the Jewish people, and God. Amra Knesset Yisrael Bnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Jewish people say to God, Ribono shel olam shelchahu hashivenu, it's your job to bring us back. Return us. Amar lahem, God said back to them, what? Me? I'm supposed to return you? No. Shalachemhu, it's yours. It's your work. Shuvu elai v'ashuvu alechem. So you're watching like sort of an epic battle between, in a time when we feel so apart, I think for one another perhaps, but here we're saying in a time where we feel so apart from God, right? We read the accounts of Eicha, which are so terribly tragic and painful. Who has to take the first step? And you watch a fight, and I just think it's amazing that Hashem is involved here and saying, me? You guys have to do the work. It's not up to me. Like, Shuvu elai. And Amra lefanav, right? And then Knesset Yisrael says back to God, oh no. Ribono shel olam shelchahu, it's yours. Why? Because I have this pasuk in Tehillim, which is Shuvenu Elohi Shenu, which goes on to say how Hashem is furious. Hashem is furious with us. So I can't, Hashem, of course I want to come back to you, but I can't because my experience of you right now is as a God who is angry. So I just want to sort of start, I love that this Midrash starts this way because I don't know about everyone else, but there is a way in which sometimes we look around the world and it's in such devastation that we just feel like there's nothing I can do. It's up to God now. I can't do anything. I feel totally powerless. And it's really, shalchahu, it's yours, God, it's your work to do. You got to help us and bring us back. But then the second part of the Midrash, I would argue, twists and turns the whole thing, which is why Midrash is so awesome, on its head. What does Chadesh Yameinu Kekedem mean? Renew us as in the days of yore, the days of old. And of course, classically, Adam Harishon. We want to go back to when things were amazing in the Garden of Eden, get us back to Gan Eden, get us back to paradise. We need you to take us back there. But fascinatingly, the pasuk that the rabbis use to prove Chadesh Yameinu Kekedem is actually a pasuk from Breshit Gimel, which is, right, actually, I'm just going to read it in English. He drove the man out and stationed east of the Garden of Eden, right? Vayishkon Mikedem legan Eden, right? I.e., Vayigaresh Hadam, meaning this is when Hashem kicks Adam out of Gan Eden, actually. This pasuk is when things are terrible. So it's like a sort of a facet. Why do you want us to get back there to when we were kicked out of Gan Eden? That's what you want to get us back to? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. Unless this is Chazal trying to tell us that what it means to return to the days of yore is actually to return to a day wherein we human beings have the potential to build, to rebuild, to build and rebuild. And it's actually interesting because the continuation of the Midrash here, and I know I have just 2 minutes left, don't worry, 2 more minutes, is actually several more examples of where we're trying to get back to. And if you look at who they are, it's Moshe, Shlomo, Noach, and Hevel, which is fascinating in and of itself. Though that foursome is interesting. But actually, if you look at the two psukim that are quoted later on, it's Moshe and it's Noach. And what's fascinating there is the pasuk that is used to prove Moshe is about after the Jewish people come out of the Yam Suf and come out of the sea and now have to traverse the desert for 40 years. So that's what you want to get us back to, the beginning of 40 years in the desert? Or we come to Noach and it's after the whole world has been destroyed. That's what you want to get us back to? Literally the whole world has been destroyed and I have to start again? So I think there's something absolutely gorgeous here in this midrash where we're hearing two, of course, maybe more like 10, but let's just say two voices. One of, I feel complete despair. I can't do anything. There's so much devastation. There's nothing I can do. And then right after, I'm told, no, you know what it means to Chadesh Yameinu Kekedem, to go back to the days of yore? It means you, human beings, pick up the mantle of responsibility, pick up the world around you that is destroyed and do work. Build, rebuild, build, and rebuild.
Thank you, Yaffa, very, very much. Alicia.
Hi, can you hear me? Yes. It is a profound honor to be here with these amazing teachers and in the presence of so many people. So thank you for inviting me. I approach Jewish texts and traditions as an artist. I'm a musician and a writer and a performer, and I see ritual, including Jewish ritual, as really inseparable from art, as a form of art, really. And I also happen to live in Portland, Oregon, which if you've been following the news, you know there's a lot going on here. And last night, I've been down at the protests a lot, and last night, my synagogue's Tisha B'Av, and along with a few others, synagogues who joined forces, there's a kind of alternative Eicha reading at City Hall, which is a couple blocks from the protest, and it was sort of an explicitly Black Lives Matter Tisha B'Av service. So, you know, when I think about Tisha B'Av this year, in light of what's happening in our country, and when I think about communal traumas, I can't help but, and I think it's important to think, for me at this moment, into and beyond the Jewish communal traumas, into the other profound traumas and losses that are happening and have happened and that continue to happen. And so I wanted to bring two poems, and I'm going to read them after I speak a little bit, because they're very short. But when I thought about Tisha B'Av, trauma, the idea of will things ever be the same, I've been thinking so much in terms of, you know, Black Lives Matter, and in terms of being in the streets and being, you know, kind of facing off with these federal agents who have come to our city, all these things that have happened, about how trauma is counterbalanced by resilience in the communities that experience trauma and the individuals, right? So on every level, from structural down to individual, I think human resilience rises in response, rises up to meet trauma, and healing also rises up to meet it. And no, it's not going to be the same. But as my other amazing panelists have been speaking about, there is a growth and a kind of blossoming that is opened by trauma. Not that we wish it, but that is, I think, the human kind of reality, and it's part of what we are all going to deal with from small levels to huge levels. So I didn't really want to think about this kind of active destruction and loss that we mourn for without also thinking about the resilience that we contain within us as a people and as individuals, as well as the healing. And of course, if we can't look at the trauma, we also can't fully inhabit the resilience and the healing. So it's a fluid kind of situation. And so I wanted to bring two poems that are in the source sheet, one by a Black American poet and one by a Jewish American poet. To me, the first is really embodies this idea of resilience in conversation with trauma. And the second, to me, actually has some themes that remind me of the Psalm of the by the waters of Babylon, and mothers and children and living in a body, and it's a little more in the sort of mourning space. So I wanted to kind of honor the tradition of focusing on mourning with that poem. So but the first poem that I'll read, which is on the source sheet if you want to look, is by Lucille Clifton, amazing Black American poet. And to me, this is a poem that really speaks to looking at the destruction, but also looking at the fact that we are alive to name the destruction and the power of that resilience. So this is called Won't You Celebrate With Me? Won't you celebrate with me what I have shaped into a kind of life? I had no model, born in Babylon, both non-white and woman. What did I see to be except myself? I made it up here on this bridge between starshine and clay, my one hand holding tight my other hand. Come celebrate with me that every day something has tried to kill me and has failed. And then I want to just close with this Jewish American poet, elder, amazing poet named Alicia Ostreicher. And this is called Exile. The downward turning touch, the cry of time, fire falling without sound, plunge my hand in the wound. Children marching and dying. All that I do is a crime because I do not reach their mouths silently crying. My boy child reaches with his mouth. It is easy being a mother. His skin is tender and soft. Kisses stitch us together. We love as long as we may, then come years without kisses, when he will turn away, not to waste breath. When I, too, will fall, embracing a pillow at night, touching the stone of exile, reaching my hand to death. And I just want to kind of end with gratitude for our explicit traditions of mourning and remembrance and ritual, and also the human ingenuity that we all carry within us to create new forms and to create new forms of community, of resistance, of celebration, of memory.
Thank you, Alicia. Okay, beautiful. Jay.
Hi everyone. It's quite an honor to be part of this panel, and again, it's sort of like it's a lovely regathering of my Pardes diaspora. So thank you for having me. Like Monty Python said, I can start by saying, and now for something completely different. Just another perspective on what changes and what doesn't. Clearly, things won't all be the same after the multiple upheavals of this year, and even maybe these last few years. But I don't think we know what will be different. In some ways, some of the traditional Jewish models here in the United States, for example, of synagogues and community groups, actually may emerge stronger as we see the value of some of the bonds of community. You know, absence makes the heart grow fonder. We might actually come to value some of the kinds of bonds and even communities that we're part of. On the other hand, who knows? As we all get used to new realities, we have no idea. So I was inspired by that lack of knowing to look at a text by one of the rabbis who ordained me, Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi, one of the founders of Jewish Renewal, a sort of non-movement movement in the United States and in Israel as well. And what Reb Zalman, for those of you who know about him, you know, is a very interesting figure in that he bridged traditional and very much not traditional Jewish and other religious and spiritual communities. He was someone who had in his mind a lot of traditional Jewish questions and remained in dialogue with traditional Jewish leaders. And one of those questions was, is everything I'm doing heresy? Is everything that I'm doing by creating kind of a new expression of non-halachic Judaism, non-normative Judaism, perhaps even a sort of post-theistic, at least in a traditional sense, Judaism, is this for the good or not? And it's a question that I've often struggled with. how much to keep and how much to discard. One of my favorite poems about this would be Adrian Rich's Diving into the Wreck, which I'd love to just recommend to everyone since Alicia just read 2 awesome poems. It's a little bit longer, not so suitable for a short session like this. But as I dive into the shipwreck of traditional culture, patriarchal culture, traditional Judaism, whatever it is, I know that I would be excluded from the ship that used to be. And yet I also know there might be treasure in the wreck. And it's that act of gathering the treasure in the wreck that I think Reb Zalman is interested in here. So if we look at the text briefly, he frames the great Sabbatean heresy, the heresy of Shabtai Tzvi in the late 1600s, a part of a real rupture in Jewish tradition in a sort of unusual sense. And really, I want to suggest that, and I think Reb Zalman is right about this, the invention of Jewish spirituality as we know it today can really be traced to the Sabbatean heresy, to the 17th century. And it was this, Reb Zalman has this wonderful word that he talks about the 1960s in the 3rd paragraph, vernalizing. It's like the vernalizing of seed. And he says that may have happened too in this early modern period, that the Sabbatean heresy, which introduced and popularized the idea of spirituality as a kind of eros, as a kind of dynamic, either sublimation or expression of human desire, really is the contribution of Sabbateanism. And he points out that if you'd been living in the 1600s, looking now at the text, you would have been sitting on, as he puts it, a lot of repressed material, not just repressed eros, but repressed spirituality, repressed religion, and the notion that you had to repress and discard all of your sexual energy in order to be spiritual or religious. And what the Sabbatean heresy, the movement of Messianism created was a kind of new channel for that energy to flow in. So in the 2nd paragraph, what is it that makes davening, that makes prayer life so exciting? It's the same kind of urge, a longing and a yearning for the divine beloved. Since the object of learning could no longer be a physical beloved because of the repressive context, of the traditional context at the time, the object of the longing gets sublimated into the messianic. Loving the Mashiach is acceptable if within the circles of those who believe in and are freed by the Mashiach, it's possible to enjoy not just sex, as Reb Zalman says here, not just within marriage, but even within a communal structure, within a communal ritual. So not necessarily sexual ritual, although there was that too, but in davening, in spiritual practice that is invested with this kind of sublimated erotic energy. That's a pretty radical characterization of Shabtai Tzvi, but I think it's accurate, and it's part of what Hasidism takes from Sabbateanism and re-domesticates within normative Judaism. And through Hasidism to Neo-Hasidism to 20th and now 21st century spirituality. It's directly traceable to this notion that our spiritual life is one to be infused with this kind of energy. And that was a radical revolution in what it meant to do Jewish ritual and do Jewish community together. It's a revolution that still is echoing today with people pro and con, and certainly in the struggle between the Hasidim and their opponents, the Mitnagdim, was at the center of what it meant to be, the debate about what it meant to be Jewish at all. What does Jewish practice look like? Is it text study primarily just for the elites, reserved for the elites, or can there be a mass Jewish spirituality in which, in the Hasidic context, in a traditional framework of Jewish prayer, at least for men at the time, it could be accessible to all men participating. And then in the Neo-Hasidic, obviously, to men and women and the rest of us. Reb Zalman continues that we experienced some of this power in the 1960s, this sublimated eros and not so sublimated. It was as if the greening of America was vernalized by this fantastic itch that was around for those of us who lived through the 60s. And this may be a way for us to get a glimpse of what it felt like at the time of Shabtai Tzvi. And then Reb Zalman turns to this question, which we'll close with, which I'm not going to really answer, but just pose for us to consider, that there is another level of difference between Jewish renewal of today and Sabbatean Messianism. In a way, he's going to say that contemporary movements are more radical because the Sabbatean heresy was playing out the messianic dream on the classical chessboard, which is to say the notion of a Messiah and the notion of redemption. While we in the 21st century say this chessboard itself is no longer where the game is being played. Our messianism is not an effort to restore what has been lost, but part of a larger effort of renewal, of finding something new. So maybe on one level, it could be said that we today are even greater heretics than the Sabbateans. They bought into this old reality map. They said, do you want to release the sparks of divinity? We can show you how to do it. But this is the last, I'm skipping to the last sentence of that paragraph, but this was still the old static stage on which they were playing. So if we let go of the concepts of the divine or the concept of Jewish community, the concept of Jewish ritual, maybe we're even greater heretics. But Reb Zalman concludes by saying, maybe, maybe not. Because if on some ways we're more heretical because we accept a changed reality map, one that's fully ecumenical, one that is not ethnocentric, one that is not patriarchal. I also believe, Reb Zalman says, there are other ways in which maybe we represent an improvement because we share a real concern about what will happen to the Jewish people in this new age. Even if we can't always give it expression, we know that what we've received is valuable. It's a sort of post-ethnocentric concern about the Jewish community and the Jewish organism and the Jewish contribution and Jewish tradition. He says, I have the feeling that the juiciest stuff of Yiddishkeit is bubbling up, and that's where the sap is flowing, because we're committed to the continuation of Judaism. So I wonder, we might be at a similar moment now where some of our conceptions of what community look like are being challenged, but the conception of what we may have to offer could actually be enriched, because the field in which we're playing, the chessboard, to use his metaphor, Reb Zalman's metaphor, is so enlarged. And there is a possibility, not that this is gamzu l'tova, that everything is for the best, but that there might be treasures in the wreck that we find ourselves in today.
Wow, thank you very much. I know I have my follow-up question I want to address, but before I have mine, I'd like to, did any of you hear anything from another participant that you would want to, you're curious about, you want to ask further, you want to even disagree with? We sometimes do that also in Jewish tradition. We can have a machloket. Okay, so I'll ask my question, and you can also jump in with yours if something occurs to you. But sort of my takeaway from all of you was really a sense of, and I'm oversimplifying, but crisis and difficulty as an opportunity for growth and change and even renewal. And I'm wondering, I just want to push back a little, and especially Marc, with the way you phrased it about we can't go back, we're not going to go back. I'm wondering, and it maybe picks up on what Yaffa spoke about, the tension, Chadesh Yemenu Kekedem, right? Renewal and restoration and how they're in tension with each other. Are there things from the past that you do think are worth fighting to maintain and preserve and get back? And whether that's the temple, whether that's something in society of the last 20 years or 50 years, whatever it might be. Are there things that you believe we should fight to maintain and or not renew, but try to hold on to or bring back, even if they've been temporarily taken away? Whichever one of you wants to go first, you can just signal me or just unmute yourself and go. Yes, Jay.
I want to respond by actually redirecting to Alicia if she's up for it. And this is by way of response to what you just said, Tzvi. There's something in the Lucille Clifton poem that's resonating with me in this moment, in this Black Lives Matter moment, but that also seems super Jewish. There's that Jewish joke that every Jewish holiday is they tried to kill us, they failed, let's eat, right? Except for Tisha B'Av when they succeeded, and so we don't eat. So it's very, so I wonder, what's tragic about that joke is the kind of perpetual victimization piece that we Jews repeat to ourselves, like every single year, so many times a year, not just on Tisha B'Av, but also Pesach and so many other holidays, and how that quickly gets turned to a kind of, well, let's just say to violent ends. We're not past that period, obviously, in Black history where but I just was struck by that resonance, that there's this affirmation of someone's trying to kill me every day and has failed, which is so beautiful and true, and yet also in the Jewish context sometimes strikes me as a conundrum.
That was part of why, I'm glad you mentioned that, Jay, because that was part of why I wanted to bring this poem. And I mean, as a white Jew, trying to show up for Black lives, I've been actually thinking explicitly a lot about how do you fight for your siblings, you know, from another group that is being oppressed and has been, without casting them as victims, you know, like while honoring their agency and their resilience. And I think the same thing absolutely applies to us and how we see ourselves as Jews. How do we name the oppression and do that work of keeping the memory alive, and not allowing it to dissipate, so that we can keep it, that kind of oppression from happening again, to the extent, you know, that we all try. How can we keep that alive, that narrative alive, without kind of collapsing into a victim narrative? And yeah, and I mean, you know, what I was thinking in response to Tzvi's question is actually also what comes to mind in response to what you mentioned, Jay, which is what I always return to, which is the essential balance between Chassette and Gevora, you know, of the sort of Kabbalistic model of there's the holding, and, or in this case, the letting go and the holding, right? There's the creation and the maintaining. There's the rejoicing and there's the mourning. There's, you know, life always bubbling up, and there's death and trauma and destruction that we also have to maintain, and that the balance between those two is this kind of heart center of Tiferet, and one or the other, one without the other, or an overabundance of one is always going to require a rebalancing, and that's never a balance that we find as a static, you know, place. I think it's always a back and forth and a rebalancing.
Yaffa, you want to go?
You go ahead, Marc.
I guess I would just think, since Alicia mentioned the balance this way, I want to think about the balance vertically in some ways, but by which I mean not a balance between, let's say, midot or spiritual kind of core spiritual truths, but a balance between past and future. And I guess first of all, I think the risk in answering your question, Tzvi, is in any way like mythologizing the past, as if there was one past. And I think often I find myself answering in a way that I acknowledge historians would probably challenge any claims, you know, I or others might make about the past we want to reclaim not being exactly the past we think it was. So I want to be cautious about that. But I guess the first thing that comes to my mind that I worry a little about as we move forward is, I guess, a sense of collective memory or story. I do think, and I'm trying to use my words carefully here, because I'm not sure I don't think it's tradition. I don't think it's about a commitment to traditional practices. I think we have to be very cautious about longing for a day when, you know, everyone practiced one kind of Judaism, because I think cultural diversity has been built into Jewish civilization for a very long time. But I do have a sense that the further away, and I want to also be careful about a kind of like Torah of Yuridata Dorot here, a kind of like depressing sense that we're just declining, because I think we're talking here about possibility and almost evolution and change, that I do worry that we and our next generation knows where we come from less and less. And that I think the power of the notion that we could crack this open and create something new, or of innovation, or even the kind of radical innovation I thought Jay was talking about, is like the idea of like remix is like, you know what you were remixing. Like, you know, I mean, you can't steal something and radically alter it if you don't know the thing, I don't think, at least. And so I do worry about what a kind of like a deep, curious, patient, disciplined engagement with what's come before us, the degree to which that is, you know, informing even sometimes our radical departure from it.
I completely agree with Rabbi Baker, and I think it's such an important message. You can't remix something if you don't know what the original tape was. I think that's such a great point. And to respond to your question too, of what should we take with us, I just want to say, I almost feel that it's impossible not to take what we have with us. Part of what I think the Midrash that I was speaking about says is that Adam and Noach and Moshe are part of our story, whether we think this is a new age or not. We have to look back. And I just want to share hope this is all right, but I want to share, actually, there was an incredible piece by Congressman John Lewis, who passed away on July 17th, and right now is the day of his burial. And he asked to have this piece published in the New York Times today. And he has one paragraph. The whole thing is beautiful and it's worth reading and incredibly powerful and stunning words, but I just want to read this part because to me it answers your question, Tzvi. He says, "You must also study and learn the lessons of history because humanity has been involved in this soul-wrenching existential struggle for a very long time. People on every continent have stood in your shoes through decades and centuries before you. The truth does not change, and that is why the answers worked out long ago can help you find solutions to the challenges of our time." And I just think that is so beautiful and powerful. And to me, that is what it means to learn Torah and what it means to learn the lessons of our past, that there is so much truth and beauty in our past, and there are solutions that have already been worked out. And I would add, humbly, there are new solutions that we have to find, but we have to build them on the solutions, truths, and struggles and lessons of the history of humanity and of the history of the Jewish people.
Tzvi, can I ask the panel a question, or do you want to move on
Please,
to another?
no, go for it.
So the thing that's been on my mind, which I think was many of us alluded to, the text I didn't bring is a quote from one of my teachers, Parker Palmer, who's written so beautifully about kind of holding paradox and like living in it gracefully. You know, he writes in his book, Healing the Heart of Democracy, something like, I'm just going to paraphrase it, you know, if we live wholeheartedly and if we look honestly at the world around us, it inevitably results in heartbreak. But then he says, the question is how the heart will break. If it breaks, if the heart shatters into a million pieces, we are left with anger and hurt and violence and fragmentation and more division. But if it can crack open in a kind of generative way, it can produce the opportunity for new life, possibility. And I feel like a lot of what I've been hearing from us today is this notion that cracking open can produce generativity. And my question for all of you is, I will say, I feel like we are at a fragile moment because I sure look around and see a lot of cracking open that looks like breaking into pieces. And I'm just curious from all of you, whether you have a sense of and or have seen examples of like what it will take for us, I don't know, individually, as a Jewish community, as a society, what it's going to take for us to lead a generative breaking as opposed to a destructive breaking.
I hate
Okay,
to be I hate to be an optimist. It's just not my nature, but
it is Tisha B'Av, but okay.
Yeah, that's right.
If I brought out your optimism, Dayenu.
Yeah, talk about uplifting the sparks within a fallen shell. I feel like this is sort of the refiner's fire in a certain period. Like nobody wants this. There's the levels of misery that we're experiencing that as a community, as a world, you know, and the inequalities in which the misery is being experienced. We're also though seeing, I think certainly in the Jewish context for me, like what works and what doesn't work and what's valuable. And there's so much, again, I hate to sound optimistic, but there's so much that is proving itself of value that we might have taken for granted in Jewish contexts that I think, because I think that was a real question. You know, when things are relatively easy, you don't see what you really need on the life raft, you know. But it's become clear to me that some kind of emotional, spiritual community is necessary for folks, right? And that's not necessarily new, like we've known that for a while, but like, so it doesn't have to necessarily be Jewish, right? But for a lot of people, it is. And if we can find the pieces of the Jewish shipwreck again, or whatever, that work for people, that I actually feel like that's helpful. I'm not necessarily there. The converse of that is that there are pieces that we're going to find that are not going to, like, oh, we really don't need this piece, but whatever. Okay, that's fine. But like, there are pieces that actually really are. So that's my answer to that. I don't think like, and I think that's true in the American polity as well. God help us for these next few months. But I actually find that we're discovering tools and resources and seeing the things that serve us and the things that don't. And again, I don't want to be mistaken for saying this is all for the best, or like, isn't it great that we just, you know, hundreds of thousands of people are dying? I'm not saying that at all, obviously, but one of the things we see when the chips are down is what's of value.
Yaffa?
I thought it was beautiful, Jay, and very optimistic. I'm sorry, Rabbi Michaelson, I should say, apologize. I just want to say one thing to what you asked, Rabbi Baker, which is that I think it's important that that the word you use, like the shattering, is of the heart. And I just think it's about, we have to find places where our hearts are open to one another. I think that's how we're going to do this, is with, it has to come back to heart and love and building conversation and spaces. And I'll just add one more optimistic, even though I do think there is important room here to mourn. And I don't think we're ready. I just want to say, I don't think we're done mourning yet. And I think that's okay. Like I wanted to call this like sort of a plug for victimization, which of course I don't really believe, but I do think I would say that we still need to be honest about, we have to mourn, and before we can rebuild, we have to sort of be in the mourning for a little while. And I think we're still in it. But one incredible thing that I think is happening, as you said, Rabbi Michaelson, about the understanding the need for community, is that people are having the opportunity to go to one another's communities in ways that they haven't before. And I'm seeing it all over the place, that people are able to learn together or pray together with communities they never could. And that is, I think that's where the magic and miracle really lies, if we could make that happen more.
Thank you. Alicia?
I just have I think I am an optimist. So I'm getting even, oddly, this time is making me even more so, that I see human creativity as such an essential part of our existence and our being. And I think resilience is almost like one name for creativity, and another way of describing it. And I think we are created, this, if God is constantly creating the world anew, and we are created in the image of God, we are constantly creating the world anew as well. And I sort of try to, I think I don't experience necessarily these, I think we like to forecast these like big kind of down overall movements of like everything is collapsing or everything is growing. And my personal sense is that, yes, that is happening in terms of trends, but there are other forms of new fabric being woven even as one system is collapsing. And this is not to take away from the suffering that's happening, but just in terms of what I also like to put my attention on. I sort of have a faith in ingenuity and creativity, and that there's a way in which, if you think about like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I think in a way that's the beginning of all of it. The beginning of getting food and shelter is like, how do I do this? How do I navigate this? And so, yeah, I like to just put my attention in that place, and to really honor the way that each of us in our own small world can also do some of that taking care of ourselves and others in a creative sense, and not succumb to despair at the structural things that are happening.
So I want to share with you a beautiful question that just came through. A lot of nice questions came through. I'm trying to combine them or mix and match a little bit. But what do you think it would take in order for the people who see themselves as polar opposites to one another the term here was used, could they mourn for each other? What would it take for them to see each other's pain and discomfort? And do you think we have resources in our tradition that help with that? I included that last part because it is a Pardes podcast after all.
I'll just start by saying something that might be provocative, but I'm not sure.
We can always hope.
I think before we talk about mourning for each other, we have a lot of work to do in mourning for ourselves. And I mean that there's just a lot of brokenness. And I think the animosity that we feel for others and the tendency to reduce them, in my view, from full human beings, dignified human beings, whose ideas and perspectives we might feel, sometimes even great disdain for, to reduce them into less than human beings, I think comes in a lot of ways from the unresolved work we've done in terms of our own pain, our own brokenness, and our own anger. And so I just would note that I think the process of moving toward the other, which I think this question asks about, does need to start with some serious inner work that we all need to do. And I will also say that I think in a time where activism is so critical, I do worry that we will neglect the kind of inner life in the name of really important outer work. We should do the opposite at our own peril. I'm not suggesting that it's an either or, but I just think we have a lot of work to do on ourselves.
Other panelists, any thoughts on how we can learn to see the other in a different way, or how our tradition might help us with that? Jay?
I think it's some of it for me personally, just really personally, has been a kind of both and consciousness. So, I think about, it's not really on the theme of Tisha B'Av, but, in terms of Yetziat Mitzrayim and the Seder and things like it, spilling a drop of wine for the Egyptians, there's not, I think some of what I struggle with in a little bit, some of what Marc just said is like both sidesism, and like that there's like things are equal on both sides, and I don't want to be like even more provocative, but I don't actually feel that way. Like, I think there is a direction of oppression in the United States. And like, I don't think, well, one side, like, I don't think if both sides are equal in a certain way. And yet I also, I'm sorry if that is too provocative, but it's, I think there's a difference between the people doing the oppressing and the people resisting, however imperfectly, that oppression. And yet that's also true of like Egypt and, the children of Israel at the time. I was also struck, by the way, just parenthetically, like of the moms movement that's now arising, and that too having its parallel in some of the midrashic stuff about moms in Egypt. In spilling drops of wine for our enemy, quote unquote enemy, it's not to say like that we're not saying both sides are equal. Like, yeah, this slavery was bad, but it's stuff on both sides are bad. Like they're definitely not saying that, right? And so for me, it's holding both of those, that both sides are not sort of equal, but that there's humanity on both sides. And that's all that's helped me. I feel like when I try to really say like, oh, I really want to put on a fake compassion hat and be, a spiritual person and see the other as myself in like some Martin Buber fake Buddhist way, like, oh, then, it's just not authentic for me. But if I can sort of hold both my like strongly held views and remembering the humanity of the person who I'm on the other side of, somehow that works better. Yeah. So spilling more wine.
I also think, to return to the Chassette and Gevora, I mean, one of my favorite things is how when you're counting the Omer, there's this focus on how each of them contain all the others, which I always think of as Trivial Pursuit pie things. But that I think that there's a discipline in opening your heart, like in pushing past what you already know. There's a force required to be compassionate outside of your own experience. And then, as Marc was saying, there's a compassion required even about that, like you have to be gentle towards your own judgment. And there's a lot of conversation among the sort of, white allies in Black Lives Matter and towards white allies in Black Lives Matter about being willing to sit with discomfort, which I think resonates to me with this, Chesed, Gevora Sheba Chesed, of, I think in order to go beyond who we are and what we know, and think about others, it requires a discomfort and a comfort, an ability to sit with discomfort, a comfort within discomfort, and I think that's a really important thing to name, whether that's the discomfort of making mistakes and saying something that you later realize was not nuanced or was uninformed, or whether it's seeing yourself as part of a system that is very uncomfortable to see yourself as part of. So yeah.
Yaffa, did you want to jump in here?
I think it's a beautiful question. And I was thinking about Rachel and Leah as a model. Even, these two sisters who in the Torah are so clearly at odds, and yet the rabbis are determined to make them love one another, and even have Rachel, sacrifice on behalf of her sister. And, we talk about, of course, Rachel on Tisha B'Av, that she is mevakal baneha, that she's crying for her children. And it's sort of an interesting, flip, because in the Torah, Leah is the one who cries, and in the rabbis' tradition, or in the rabbis' reading of Leah in the Torah, she's the one who cries, but later Rachel is crying for her children. And I think there's something interesting about that can be a model, at least in how the rabbis choose to read Rachel later on, as she could see her sister's potential pain and embarrassment. And instead of allowing that to happen, she stepped in for her. And she could feel her sister's pain. I wonder about, not to respond to what you were saying before, Jay, that not that I validate your position or agree with you, but that you are in pain, and that if we can get to that point of seeing the pain, I do think we have models for that, and it will ultimately bring the redemption, seeing the pain of the other.
Wow. Before we close, I want to make sure, is there anybody in the panel that has something that they wanted to share and didn't get a chance to say, or there's something that they wanted to put out there? Okay, I just want to say two things. First of all, I want to thank the four of you so much for giving so generously of your time and your wisdom. And I think especially at a time where a lot of us really needed to hear it and feel a little inspiration. So kol hakavod to all of you in terms of your generosity and your wisdom and your wonderful comments. And I think for all of us, right, Tisha B'Av is also ideally supposed to be a day of tikkun, for destruction, right? That if we go through it right, we can fix something. And I guess the challenge for all of us who have the privilege of listening to all of you is we have to think about what it is we can take away from what you've said, and what type of tikkun we can make, and hopefully during the course of the year feel that we grew from our learning and our experience together. So from those of us in Israel who are closing our Tzom, and for those of you who are in North America still experiencing with Tzom, on behalf of Pardes, thank all of you, both the panel, of course, and all the people who joined. All the best. Besurot Tovot.